As you've heard, this is a very special day in the life of our cathedral. The celebration of a hallowed tradition, Africa Day, here at Trinity Cathedral, and Juneteenth, a national holiday marking the end of slavery in our country. I will speak more about Juneteenth in a little while. I am tag teaming this sermon this morning with Dr. Don Taylor, who many of you know as a longtime verger. He has held many roles, served in many roles here at the cathedral, including on the vestry, and he currently serves on the Diocese of Northern California Board of Trustees. We began celebrating Africa Day at Trinity Cathedral many, many years ago to celebrate the many gifts and blessings brought to us by the African immigrants in our congregation. I know there is a lot to be anxious about in our nation and the world, especially this morning with the bombing of Iran yesterday. We don't know how any of this will turn out, and that is all the more reason for us to celebrate our blessings. We are richer and more vibrant in every way because of the blessings we receive from the Africans in our congregation. And I am personally blessed at having Don Taylor as a friend for many, many years. When I was interim dean, one of my greatest pleasures was giving him a Dean's Award. So please let me tell you a little bit about Don that you may not know. Don was born in Sierra Leone, and he is a famous figure in West Africa as the national news anchor for Sierra Leone Broadcasting Service and as a correspondent for the BBC when he lived there. He earned his bachelor's degree from Sheffield City University in the UK, and then a master's degree at Leeds University in the UK. He earned his PhD in communications from Kent State here in the United States. For 33 years, Don was a professor of communication studies at the California State University, Sacramento, and held several administrative posts. In the year 2000, he took a sabbatical leave from Sac State to work in the White House Office of Scientific Research, studying the digital divide between underserved regions of the world and the United States. He is also a Fulbright Scholar and a Hubert Humphrey Fellow in Public Policy. He travels frequently throughout Africa and has written numerous publications, and he is a much sought-after speaker. We, of course, know why Don is a sought-after speaker. When he reads a biblical lesson on a Sunday morning for us, we hear him as the voice of God. So I present to you my very dear friend, Don Taylor.
Thank you very much, Jim. Good morning. Today, as members and friends of Trinity Episcopal Cathedral here in Sacramento, as you already know, we gather here to recognize and celebrate Africa Day and Juneteenth. Two events, separate but conjoined, in the sense that we seek to recognize the collective identity and progress of the historical struggles and opportunities of African peoples in the continent of Africa and in the wider African diaspora, including the United States, the Caribbean, and elsewhere. As I reflect on why we celebrate this day, I'm going to deviate slightly from today's gospel because I'm going to leave that to you, Jim, so that I can bring to the fore the great commission offered by Jesus to Peter, which we heard in this church a few weeks ago, in which Jesus had asked Peter, "Do you love me? If you do, feed my sheep." Over the years, I have encountered a variety of perspectives on this theme, most of which seek to examine the concept of love, including its definition, its etymology, its value, its essence, etc. But even in the face of these brilliant theological and biblical exposés, I have personally never lost sight of what I considered the fundamental pillar of this great commission: to feed my sheep. As I reflect then on today's celebration, I ask, how have we prepared ourselves to feed God's sheep in the specific context of Africa and the African experience, in ways that would enable us to provide sustenance, the basis of food, sustenance that is built on love. That love that directs us to love the Lord as Christ loved us, as we together seek to advance the human race. My friends, permit me to expound on this for just a few minutes from the prism of the global African experience before I turn over to my friend, Reverend Jim Richardson, for the rest of today's homily. As you've already heard from Reverend Megan, Africa Day was established on the 25th of May, 1963, to celebrate the shared history, culture, and achievements of Africans in a specific period, 1963, a period of decolonization, a period looking for liberation of African nations and their peoples from hundreds of years of stifling colonial controls, subjugation, and slavery. Africa Day was established during this period, which was also known as the period of the wind of change around the world. It appeared in the United States. We saw the emergence and strengthening of the civil rights movement at that same time. We saw the women's movement take shape and direction. We saw nations around the world agitating for independence and national self-rule. We saw the youth rebellion and more, all of which sought the dismantling of systems that some commentators may have referred to as repressive, but also to uplift African cultural values and to chronicle their progress towards development. This is 2025, 62 years later since Africa Day was established. We still see the need to celebrate because it remains a core goal of African peoples the world over, even in the face of national independence and self-rule in many of these countries. There are 54 countries now, each with its own cultural and geographic uniqueness and identity. Just to be clear, Africa is not a country. Just to be clear, it is a continent. In fact, it is the second largest continent on planet Earth. But take a look at social media and popular culture, whether in movies, books, or schools, or churches. We see them replete with stereotypical images of Africans: poverty, disease, famine, illiteracy, disorganized political systems, environmental degradation. And woe betide, you dare think you have the capacity for innovative or intellectual prowess. So it is not surprising, and Jane mentioned my work at the university, and at some point in my career there, I was the senior international officer, and we were responsible for study abroad programs. I looked at the list of places that students want to go to get an international experience. Most of them signed up to go to London and Paris and Rome and Madrid and many other European centers. A few went to Australia and a handful went to Asia. African nations were not selected for study abroad programs. They were not offered. So as senior international officer working with the Chancellor's office, I insisted that we had to find a way to add Africa to the CSU study abroad program, and we did. We added Ghana and South Africa. Well, let me tell you, it did not improve the selections of where students wanted to go. Studying in Ghana, a few. South Africa, a few. But overall, going to Africa remained limited and unattractive. You see, these realities, I don't want to blame our students. They were produced through colonial systems, slavery, and all the history you know about, that serve to negate the contribution of African culture, African knowledge, and African innovativeness to the human race. You see, it is the complex mix of all of this that I draw your attention to the greatest African literary scholar that I know, Chinua Achebe from Nigeria. During this same period of the 60s, he wrote the book, Things Fall Apart, in which he chronicled the struggles of African people in their efforts to coexist with the difficult influences of the rest of the world, including churches operating in Nigeria. To situate his work, Achebe borrowed from the work of W. Yeats, the great poet, and he began his book with these words from Yeats. Turning and turning in the widening eye, the falcon cannot bear the falconer. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold, and mere army is let loose upon the world. He saw that, we see that, and we see what that army let loose upon the world open up. Apartheid, extraction of raw materials, erasure of ethnic languages and culture as unfit for modernization, intellectual discourse, or development. This is why I'm happy that today the church asks readers to bring us the scripture in their language. Because till this day, as I speak, the official language of many of those 54 countries I talked about in Africa remain the language of the colonial oppressors. In many of those countries, of those of you seated here today, that Christine brought to us today in Swahili. Swahili is an international language of discourse. Let me go a little bit further, and I know we're looking at the time. But I want to give you some personal experiences that I hope help to shape the discourse I'm framing. Yes, Jim, I have traveled quite a lot around the world, you're quite right. And I've spent a lot of those times traveling to Africa, different places. And I want to talk about the impact of those three places on me. My visit to Robben Island in South Africa. I don't know how many of you have heard of the name Nelson Mendela, but if you have, you know that he was a formidable freedom fighter, striving to bring about a majority rule for the majority of the people in South Africa. He was in prison. He was in prison for 28 years. At the time of his life in prison, he ended up serving 28 years. So one of the first places I wanted to visit with my wife, we went there together, was Robben Island of Cape Town. We went to see the prison and the cell, the actual cell that had held Nelson Mandela for 26 years. It was a concrete floor, cold and damp, with a thin mat, a thin pillow, and a thin blanket. How that man survived that condition for 26 years, I continue to believe is a miracle. But he survived and later freed his country and became the first African president of South Africa. Let me turn to another visit, this time to Ghana in West Africa, to Cape Coast. I took 25 students on a cultural educational trip to learn about Africa. We spent 6 weeks there, and we visited Elmina Castle in Cape Coast. The significance of Elmina Castle is that this was the central point from which slaves were shipped across the Atlantic to what was described as the New World. They kept everything pristine and in place for nearly 500 years at Elmina Castle. My students were white, black, Asian, Hispanic, all of them. We had a mixed group. They were introduced to the manure, the feces of the slaves that had solidified and fossilized. To each student, they knelt on that soil and wept. Diverse groups of students, they wept. And they asked me, who didn't have the answer, why can we be so wicked to each other? The most moving point of them was when they brought us to the door of no return. There is a door exiting the castle that brings you to the shores of the Atlantic Ocean. Once you're put on those boats, you never return to Africa. But as I lament all these experiences, I want to tell you about a different kind of experience I had in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. I met Lucy. By the way, I said Lucy is not a girlfriend, it's just Lucy. Just so you know. All right? Lucy was the skeletal fossil remains of the earliest known female on our planet. She had been discovered by archaeologists, and her fossil remains were found in Ethiopia and is believed to be over 3 million years old. Lucy's skeletal fossil are encased in a glass showcase in the Ethiopian Museum. And as I stood there peering into that glass showcase, I looked for the legacy that Lucy left for us in the human race. The opportunity for continued growth and expansion of the human race with all its limitless possibilities to feed God's sheep. As I stared at Lucy's skeletal remains, I looked beyond the stereotypes often associated with Africa to see a continent that possesses a wealth of unique and often untold qualities, particularly in terms of its history, its resilience, and its contribution to the advancement of the human race. I saw in Lucy the cradle of human civilization. I saw the invention from Africa of such things as the alphabet, of architecture, of farming, of mathematics, of formal education, and medicine, to name a few, all of which originated in Africa. That represents the legacy of Lucy. I continued to peer into that glass showcase, and I saw a vast array of untapped resources in minerals, gold, diamond, iron ore, bauxite, oil, fishing, and more than anything else, I saw demographics, the youngest population group on earth now are the Africans, the youngest. And that tells me that there's more for Africa to give to the rest of the world. Through Lucy, I also saw the effort to dismantle slavery and apartheid, to create conditions to learn from one another and to love God as He loves us. Through Lucy, I saw the fierce urgency of the work of religious leaders like our former presiding bishop, Michael Curry, and so many others, including the work of W.E.B. Du Bois, Martin Luther King, Edward Wilmot Blyden, and others. So, my friends, why celebrate Africa Day and Juneteenth? For me, it's simple. It helps us draw on the lessons of the past and explore new ways to spread God's love and to be ready to answer Jesus' call. Do you love Him? If you do, feed my sheep. Thank you.
Thank you, Don. Thank you. I am going to talk about legacies and the legacy of Juneteenth. The first enslaved Africans came to our shores in 1619 aboard the Dutch warship presciently named White Lion. They were kidnapped in West Africa and were the distant ancestors of Don and many of those in this congregation here today. These first slaves were purchased by white English settlers at Jamestown, Virginia. Most histories of Jamestown do not mention that. Slavery would spread through this land in all 13 British colonies and then into the new states and territories as the United States expanded. Manifest Destiny had much to do with slavery. Slavery would not officially end until a terrible civil war that claimed 750,000 people in our country. Juneteenth, the day we are observing today, does not in fact mark the day that slavery ended. It marks the 19th day in June 1865 when black people in Texas found out they were no longer enslaved. They found out 2 months after the end of the Civil War and 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. They heard it from Union General Gordon Granger, whose army had finally reached Galveston, Texas. Until then, white Texans had kept the news of the end of slavery away from those who they had enslaved. June 19th has been celebrated among black Americans ever since then, first in Texas and then elsewhere as blacks migrated out of the South. Juneteenth is now a national holiday for all Americans, signed into law by President Biden. Juneteenth, though, is complicated. The fact is, slavery did not end when Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. Slavery did not end when Robert E. Lee surrendered his army at Appomattox Courthouse in April 1865 in Virginia. And it can be argued that slavery did not end even in June 1865 in Texas or elsewhere, when one system of forced labor was replaced by another system of forced labor, sharecropping. Juneteenth, then, might better be seen as a celebration of the courage, resistance, and resilience of black Americans in the face of centuries of hatred, prejudice, struggle, and enslavement. And Juneteenth is better thought of, I think, as a reminder to all Americans that the work of freedom and equality is not ended. And to put this in terms of our baptismal covenant, the work of respecting the dignity of every human being and striving for justice and peace for all people is not ended. The tragic fact is, we have never fully faced the barbarity of slavery or its aftermath in the United States. As commentator Jonathan Capehart puts it, slavery is this nation's foundational wound. The past shapes who we are, often in ways we don't see, and sometimes in ways we don't want to see. This is the legacy we carry with us, like it or not. But we carry another legacy, the stories of those who followed a different path, breaking down the walls of oppression and bondage. As many of you know, I wrote a book about my anti-slavery abolitionist ancestors who used their home in Illinois on the Underground Railroad before the Civil War, and then after the war founded a college for the previously enslaved in Texas that is still thriving today as Houston-Tillotson University. That is a story for another day. Many black Americans have fought for freedom over the centuries. Some maybe you've heard of, and some you should hear of. Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, Ida B. Wells, W.E.B. Du Bois, Howard Thurman, Pauli Murray, John Lewis, Martin Luther King Jr., Jesse Jackson, and many, many others. This too is the legacy we carry with us. And this is precisely the place Jesus takes us this morning in the gospel lesson from Luke. Jesus declares by word and action that whatever power holds people captive is illegitimate and not of God. You may be enslaved, but you are not a slave. In the story from Luke, Jesus frees a man who is living in a cemetery, and he's been enslaved by demons. Commanded by Jesus to free the man, the demons leave the man and jump into a herd of pigs, and then the pigs jump off a cliff into the Sea of Galilee. The man is healed. But there's a second part to the story. Freedom comes with a cost. The townspeople have only known the man as enslaved by demons, and they are filled with fear seeing him freed and healed. Their social order is upset. The change is too much. They beg Jesus to leave, so he does. They beg the healed man to leave. He leaves. Perhaps this story is an object lesson for what happened in our country at the end of the Civil War in 1865. The former enslavers could not accept the new order. They unleashed the Ku Klux Klan, terrorizing newly freed blacks and the whites who supported them. My ancestors barely escaped vigilantes twice. Then came institutional racial segregation, the so-called Jim Crow laws, lasting for another century, finally broken, piece by piece, chain by chain, in the civil rights struggle of our own time. This struggle is not ended. This struggle continues with us. We also know captivity comes in many forms. Slavery still exists in much of our world. There is still human trafficking in our country, including sex trafficking. People are held captive in our world in other ways, by drug and alcohol addiction, mental illness, choking poverty, and violence in all its forms. In word and action, Jesus lays down a marker for us. We are the agents of emancipation for all that enslaves people. We are the agents of freedom, one act of dignity, one act of justice at a time. We have always struggled with how to do this. We don't always agree, and we haven't always done it well, but we learn. We pick up the pieces. We keep going. The Apostle Paul was no stranger to this struggle, and he didn't get it right all the time either. But the Apostle Paul stood firm, telling us this. This is foundational to all of it. Know who you are and know whose you are. Know who you are and know whose you are. Your condition in life does not define you. Whatever holds you captive does not define you. There is no longer Jew or Greek, he declares. There is no longer slave or free. There is no longer male or female. For all of you are one in Christ Jesus. The risen Christ connects us in all times, in all places, whether we are aware of it or not. And this fact changes everything about us. And if you belong to Christ, Paul continues, then you are Abraham's offspring, heirs according to the promise of God. Jesus, the risen Christ of Easter, who touched Paul and millions who came after him, still touches us, still connects us to each other, still beckons us to free the enslaved, to live with faith, hope, and love, and to live with courage. So, my friends, be safe, be well, be brave, be blessed. Amen.